What's up? I am David Long. This is part of the Non-Reductionist Fundamental series. This is the deep dive, and this is part 3, Quadrants. If you don't know what non-reductionism is yet, or you haven't seen part 1 and part 2 of this series on our principles and community structure, I recommend watching the Fundamental Deep Dive playlist from the beginning. Link in the description. That'll give you the context that you need. In this video, we're going to start by talking about divisions of 4, which is the more fundamental tool from which the quadrants are derived. Even though quadrants are the main thing we want to talk about here, I think it's helpful to understand divisions of 4 first, because this is a thinking tool that has been used to create many of the maps and frameworks that you're probably already familiar with. We've often been taught the maps themselves, but not the underlying tool that make them possible. So I want to start by teaching you the very useful tool that has been used to generate the quadrants and many other maps throughout history. From there, we'll dive into the quadrants themselves. I'll explain how they relate to the history of philosophy, how they offer a simplicity on the other side of complexity by helping us understand the fundamental categories of reality that, frankly, most people never really clearly distinguish. And most importantly, how to actually use them as a practical tool in everyday life, no matter what the project or topic is. Then, in the final section, we'll look at the 3 upgrades to meta theory that are unique to non-reductionist philosophy: quadratic zoom, scale, and primacy. These distinctions add important layers of nuance to the quadrants. They help us avoid common errors by considering the appropriate level and scale of our analysis, along with how the different aspects of reality relate to one another and their relative importance depending on the project. In my opinion, this video is the most complete presentation of the quadrants ever put together. Let me know if you agree or not in the comments. One thing I want to mention before we get started is that throughout this video, I'm going to be showing a lot of different maps and examples. The purpose of those examples isn't to teach each individual map in detail. They're there to help you understand how these tools work in general. So if you ever feel like I'm moving quickly, or you're wishing I would spend more time explaining a particular example, don't worry, we'll be coming back to many of these ideas in future videos. Right now, I just really want you to focus on learning the tools themselves. Once you understand the tools, you'll be able to apply them to virtually anything. With that, let's jump into it.
The first thing that I'm going to talk about today is actually going to be divisions of 4.
The reason why is because quadrants is basically a version of divisions of 4. It's divisions of 4 applied to reality, or to ontology, to aspects of reality. So divisions of 4 is basically duality within duality. Or you take 2 related dualities and put them against each other. So for example, in quadrants, which we'll talk about later, there's interior aspects of reality, exterior aspects of reality, individuals and collectives. But first we're going to explore other versions of divisions of 4, and I'm going to show you how to use that tool, because knowing how to use divisions of 4 is also very useful, and you can apply it to a lot of different things. Divisions of 4 then becomes more a way of taking different perspectives on things, while later quadrants is more about getting a holistic perspective by making sure that you're looking at a thing in relation to all the different aspects of reality. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is this idea of life positions, which does this duality of me versus you and okay versus not okay. So it's I'm okay, you're okay, which is a position in which we're happy. There's I'm okay, you're not okay, which is a position in which I'm angry. There's I'm not okay, you're okay, which is a feeling of helplessness. And then I'm not okay, you're not okay, which is a feeling of hopelessness. And then another thing that's very similar is the outcome matrix, which is win-win versus lose-lose, and I win, you lose, or you win, I lose, which is again doing the win and lose, me and you. There's another version version of this, good for me and good for you, or bad for you and bad for me, good for me but bad for you, and good for you but bad for me. And this is doing the same kind of thing, good and bad, win and lose, me and you. These outcome matrices apply to game theory or conflict resolution or negotiation, things like that. You get it. So we're basically crossing two different dualities. I think another really interesting example of this is where you basically put something in the middle and then you talk about the different possible perspectives on a thing. And let me give you an example of how that works. America. You might be in America like, yay, America. And then you might be in America and be like, I'm an American, but I feel like I'm not really cool with America. And then you might be in not America and you might be like, yeah, I'm glad I'm not an American. And then you might be in not America and you might be like, yeah, I wish I was in America. The cycle here is going one way. Like imagine you start in America and you get disillusioned and you feel like I don't even want to be here anymore. And then you move out and you're like, yeah, this is good. And then maybe after a while you're like, I miss America. And then you go back and you're like, okay, I'm glad to be in America again. But it could go the other way too. Like you could get ripped out of America and be like, I miss America. And then maybe eventually you acquiesce and you get happy being outside of America. But then maybe you get ripped back into America and you're like, I don't like this. I don't want to be in America. Maybe eventually you start to like America again. So you could see how you could end up in any one of these positions coming from either angle. So it's not even just a matter of what position you're in, but also it can tell us what position you're in and what position you're coming from. And that can also tell us something about the context of what it means for you to be in that position. Until you've really been around, you don't really have a whole perspective on a thing. Divisions of 4 is basically a way to think about a bunch of different perspectives on a thing. I can show you some more examples of things that I have used this tool on so you can get some kind of an idea of the diversity of its use. Here's another thing. This is types of pre-Orthodox versions of Christianity. On the bottom half, you have Christians that include the Old Testament. The top half, you have Christians who think the Old Testament God is evil. On the left, you have Christians who think that Jesus is a man. And on the right, you have Christians who think Jesus is God. And so this is actually a very complex topic to explain all the different variations of early Christianity and how they relate to each other and their ideas about Jesus. This graph is a great way to quickly show how they all have different ideas about who Jesus was and what he came to do. You can contrast side to side and up and down and across. And so you can really start to see how they all have different concepts. The Ebionites think that Jesus was all man, and the Marcionites think that Jesus was all God. The Proto-Orthodox think that he was God that became a man, and then the Gnostics have this idea that he's a man who will realize he's God. That's just a very quick explanation. I could go way more into detail, but you get the idea. I'll show another one now. This one is about day language versus night language, rationality and mythology. There's things that are known. They're known to be true with evidence, or they're known to be false with evidence. And there's things that are unknown, things that still are unexplained and need evidence, and then things that are unknowable or beyond evidence. Day language and science basically deals with evidence, trying to get evidence for things and evidence that we've gathered. These are the more literal type things. And then mythology or night language, symbolism, we know that it's not literally true, but it's metaphorically true. Or we know it's a mystery beyond all categories of thought, but we're going to tell stories about it. I'll give one more example of this and then I'll move on. So this is what I call the assimilation and projection cycle. This is a 2-for-1. So on one hand, you have your subjective perspective, and on the other side, you have the objective experience. Your subjective perspective gets projected out, and your perspective defines your experience. And then after you had your experience shapes your perspective. That's assimilation. This creates kind of a cycle. And in the middle, there's this relative filter of meaning. So you get categories of ontology and this cycle. And then I have possible reactions to experience, confirm and contradict. So if it confirms your idea, it's like, yeah, that's what I thought. You could justify. But then on the other hand, you might either ignore or change. If it's something that you ignore, then it gets into this unconscious repression, and that's where shadow happens. So the bigger your shadow gets, the more likely it's going to come up over and over again in your experience, and the more likely it is you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to bring it into your awareness. So like I said, these were just ways that I was using this divisions of 4 as a way to think about these different things in relation to each other and come up with either some kind of a cycle of different ways of taking perspective or understanding different variations. Another really common and popular version of this that I'm sure that you're aware of is the political matrix. And of course, there's better and worse versions
versions of this. Most of them are doing something like left and right, but then the other ones could be liberal versus authoritarian, socially progressive and socially conservative, or it might do statist versus autonomy, socialist versus capitalist. There's a handful of variations, and some are better than others, but you get the idea. Even Briggs-Myers types is basically this tool. It's also doing Zoom, because you have introvert, extrovert, thinking and feeling, and then that creates 4 types, but even then within that 4 types, it's subdivided again in each one: sensing, intuiting, and perceiving, judging. And then he even does even further levels of the Zoom. Within each type, there are the ego, the superego, the subconscious, and unconscious. And then within each one of those categories, then there's 4 functions. So that's divisions of 4 within divisions of 4 within divisions of 4 within divisions of 4, and you start to get tons more nuance. So this is a good tool to have in your back pocket if you want to think about something, if you want to think about the different possibilities, not necessarily ontological categories like with quadrants, but if you just want to brainstorm about a subject or a topic or something, this could be a useful way to get some perspective on it. I thought I'd start here because it also shows the real origin of where these ideas come from, and it shows that they've been used throughout history. And just thought I'd show some different examples of how you could use it to get different perspectives on things, or as a different way to categorize things. It's super helpful to have this map that doesn't just get stuck in simplistic binaries, but zooms in further, and we can start to see binaries within binaries, quadrants within quadrants. Even back when I first had this model, I knew that you could zoom in further and find dualities within the dualities within the dualities.
Sorry to interrupt. Just one moment. I'd like to talk to you real quick about Patreon. So for a long time, what I used to do is I would just ask for your support on Patreon. I'd put your name at the end of the video, give you a big thank you, and call it good. But I've been putting more thought into how I can bring more value to my awesome Patreons who support this important project. For those of you who still want to do the basic amount of support, we have the supporter tier. You can give $5 or $10, and it'll be the same deal as before. I'll put your name at the end of the video, give you a big thank you and a shout out, and we'll call it good. But for those of you who are looking for more, who want to dig in deeper, we have the participant level Patreons. They'll get the same thing as before, but they'll also get to come to this live Q&A. And if you want to become a participant plus, you'll get to do all those things, come to the live Q&A, and come to a monthly private training. And for those of you who really want to dig in deep, join at the apprentice level. Get everything we've mentioned before, as well as an hour or 2 a month with me for private coaching or training or whatever you'd like. I know there's a lot of people on the internet right now who are asking you to become their Patreon, but remember, this is a small community, and so your support is much needed and much appreciated. Big thanks to all the people who support on Patreon. It really means a lot to me, and it's going to make a lot more possible going forward. Thanks so much for listening to me talk about Patreon. I'll let you get back to your video now.
Even just having the concepts of what is the basic duality around this thing. And then you could go, okay, but then how could I find the duality within the duality? And then that's a better way to flesh it out a little bit more. It's a great skill to practice perspective shifts and begin to think about the complexities of a topic beyond just simplistic dualities. And you can even zoom in more and find more. A major problem that happens with a lot of people who do the simplistic binaries, like Jordan Peterson, for example, he's doing the like order and chaos and day and night, and man and woman. And then he ends up conflating them, where it's like woman is chaos. So it's not like a divisions of 4 where you separate off the masculine and feminine versions of chaos, where you do like an intersection where both male and female could have their own versions of chaos. No, woman is chaos, you see? So even just having intersections and different categories within categories is so much better than having a list of binaries that you might conflate into each other. That's a major problem that we see happening a lot in a lot of these postmodernists in their binary thinking.
Hopefully by now you can see why this is such a useful tool. Divisions of 4 helps us to explore the different possible perspectives people can have in relation to any topic. In doing so, we can better understand not only what those perspectives are, but why someone might come to hold them in the first place. This is a great tool for developing a more well-rounded understanding of any topic. The more thoroughly we understand the landscape of possible perspectives, the more informed our own thinking becomes. Taking the time to understand the landscape before reaching conclusions puts us in a much better position to make wise decisions. And hey, if there was a particular map or example from the section that we just watched that you found especially interesting or wish I had spent more time explaining, let me know in the comments below. There's a good chance I'll make a dedicated video on it in the future. Now, as I said, although quadrants are one example of divisions of 4, they're actually doing something a little different. Divisions of 4 are primarily a tool for exploring different perspectives or ways of understanding something. Quadrants, on the other hand, is a tool for understanding the different aspects of reality that make up or relate to a thing or a project. So in this next section, we'll begin by relating the quadrants back to philosophy history. Then I'll explain how the quadrants work, what each one of them represents, and how to use them as one of the most practical, powerful meta-theory tools you'll ever learn. Let's dive in.
The next thing is called the Big Three. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Buddha, Sangha, Dharma, the Maiden, Mother, and Crone. No, not these three. The big three in philosophy are the good, the true, and the beautiful. This goes back to Plato, and Aristotle talked about art, morals, and science as the categories. These are all important categories of philosophy, and checking in with, is this good, is this true, is this beautiful? It's part of having a holistic approach to something. This is what's getting us into the beginning of the quadrants. Expanding it into 4 is really helpful because instead of having objective, subjective, and relative is intersubjective, now we can have subjective and intersubjective, objective and interobjective. And so now we can have facts and theories. So a subcategory within the true. The left side is interior, the right side is exterior, the top is individual, the bottom is collective. We've moved away from vague conceptualizing about duality that you can project onto anything to basically taking the divisions of 4 and applying it to ontology, aspects of reality. So quadrants is about different ontological categories, different ontological zones, actual aspects of reality. When we look at the quadrants of things, we're always looking at the exact same things, aspects of reality as it relates to a thing. It's not a vague perspective finding tool. These are not perspectives. This is where a lot of people mess up quadrants by thinking of them as perspectives. Sure, you can take a first person, a second person, and a third person perspective on a thing. That's what we're doing when we're looking at these different categories. But think of them as ontological zones, actual aspects of reality. Upper left is interior individual. It is I language. I feel this, I like this. Self and consciousness, intentions, subjectivity, contemplation, shadow, psychology, life practice. Purpose, values, calling, what I like, what I feel, what I value, what I intend, and it's known by felt experience. Upper right quadrant is it language, exterior individual, brains, organisms, behaviors, what is objective, what is empirical, scientific method is used to gather this information, physics, biology, neurology, statistics, goals, facts. So up top we have subjective and objective. And for a lot of people, they actually think these are the only categories. These are the only categories most people know about. This is why they want to put the good in the subjective, because it's not objective, so it must be subjective. Good is relative. Good relative to what? Good for who? Good for what? Good for what end? A lot of times people misuse that word relative. The way that I like to think about it is like a relative, right? Like related to. Like related to what? It's a useful way to think about it, I think. Good for what? Good for who? Good to what end? These are the questions. It's not really subjective because with health, right? If you value your health, if you care about what's good for your health, we can actually make fact claims about whether something is good or not. That's not purely subjective. It's not really a matter of opinion. Once we define what the category is, you could even make objective claims about something being good or not, as long as we know for what, relative to what. So let's go to the we space. This is the collective interior. It is we language. We value this. We agree about this. Culture, worldview, meaning, morality, values, the intersubjective, community values, known by established agreement. When you look up something in the dictionary, it means what it means because we agree that's what it means. When you think about language, really this is what we should probably think about when we think about the we space is language. We don't come up with our own personal language. Language is something we use to communicate with other people. We have to agree on what things mean to be able to talk about a thing. Usually if you're debating something with someone, you start by defining your terms. You go, okay, well, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? Sometimes if you define a new term or if you launch a new thing, you get to say what something means, but it really only works if you can get other people to agree with it or to use it or to adopt it. The value of coins and money is an example. Yes, it's an agreed upon value. And then on the other side, the lower right exterior collective, it's its language, it's plural. So social systems, economics, environments, interobjective theories, cosmology. In the upper right, we would collect facts. And then in the lower right, we take those facts and interpret them in some kind of theory. So it's known by systemic analysis. The upper right quadrant is like a single measurement, one measurement. Here's a fact, here's a fact, here's a fact, here's a fact. And then the interobjective, the lower right quadrant is more like theories and systems. So it could actually include multiple different factors, multiple measurements or multiple facts or multiple elements. The lower right quadrant might be taking into account facts from every other quadrant, whereas the upper right quadrant is a single fact, a single measurement. Evolution is an example of a lower right quadrant thing. It's a theory. There's a whole bunch of evidence that you would gain in the upper right about evolution, DNA evidence and fossils. You stack a bunch of these little facts up over time, and then, yeah, the theory is like a meta-analysis of this data, but then there's also systems. Systems aren't a meta-analysis as much as they are a collection of individual parts that come together to create a whole. So usually traditional people tend to favor the upper left quadrant, and red people too. I would say like red and Christian blue especially end up appealing to personal experience. I have my own personal relationship with God, all this kind of stuff. There might be other traditions that are not so heavily focused on personal experience. Islam is probably not so obsessed with personal experience like Christians are. Exterior upper right quadrant, the it quadrant, that's usually more a rational, orange, modern, materialist kind of a perspective. They're more likely to do upper right quadrant reductionism, even sometimes to the point of denying the existence of things that can't be experienced or touched or felt or seen as a tangible object. The lower left quadrant, the we space, is something that's more focused on by postmodern green people. A lot of times they'll be lower left quadrant reductionist. And then the lower right quadrant, sometimes it can be something that orange focuses on as well, but it's often the main focus of yellow, trying to understand systems. So something to keep in mind. I would also say that most people tend to orient from a particular quadrant, and then they might have a certain quadrant that they deprioritize or undervalue or ignore. For example, I more orient to the lower right quadrant. That's probably why I'm into these meta theories and stuff in the first place, is because I'm more of a lower right quadrant thinker. I like to step back and try to get perspective on things. Whenever I'm stressed about a thing or want to try to understand it, I'll try to figure out some way to get concepts about it. And that's also why I liked divisions of four and stuff early on. Whereas I'm not as much of an upper left quadrant person. I'm not a person who is that much interested in being super in touch with my feelings. So knowing that about myself is an important thing, that I need to take into account my feelings, think more about my feelings, express my feelings more. So just knowing the quadrants that you favor, that you like the best, and the ones you might tend to ignore is very helpful. It's usually one quadrant focused at the expense of the others, or one side upper or lower at the expense of the other. It's also interesting, you see these perspectives arguing as opposite sides all over the place. Nature versus nurture, individual versus collective. People are arguing from different quadrants all over the place. And it's as if a lot of times they think that their perspective is right and the other perspective is wrong. There's value on both sides in a particular context, or there's a way of integrating. It's like, no, community, no, individual rights. How about both? How about individual responsibility and community opportunity systems? How about both? So you might think that by taking into account all four of these factors, the subjective, the objective, the intersubjective, and the interobjective, that is all the categories. But it is not. There is still an extra category at play here. It is the absolute. One way to think of it is the absolute is underneath all of these quadrants, and the quadrants are a relative map of the territory. So one way of talking about the absolute in philosophy is the thing in itself. We only have relative symbols to be able to talk about it. And this is also where a lot of people go wrong too, is they think that facts are the absolute. They confuse objective and absolute. And this is a major problem a lot of people at Orange have. Sometimes postmodernists will be like, there are no facts. It's like, no, there are facts. You're trying to say that we can't know the absolute truth. That's different than knowing facts. Our perspective is really limited, and we only have words to be able to communicate about anything and to be able to understand. We also understand with words, with concepts. So that's why people say everything is relative, because basically we talk about everything with words and symbols. So our way of talking about everything is relative. The more basic application is like what I was saying before about realizing which quadrants you favor and which quadrants you might be weak in. The other general basic way of applying the quadrants or using them in relation to everything is thinking of them as a checklist. One of the examples that I usually give is I'm moving from here to there. In terms of the upper right, I have my to-do list, the things I need to do to be able to move. I got to get boxes. I got to fill them up. I got to put them in the thing, right? Like all the to-do list things. Probably everybody who's moving makes the to-do list. Check. But some of the other factors are things that they might not get that in touch with. Like, for example, taking some time to think about, how do I feel about this move? What are my feelings around this? How is this affecting me? That's an important thing to check in with as you're doing the move. Another important thing would be the lower left, which is, how is this going to affect the relationships in the place that I'm currently at? And what about the relationships that I'm going to need to establish or get in touch with where I'm going? I need to touch in with all my local friends before I leave. Maybe I need to put together like a going away party for myself. I need to spend like one last good time with my friends. Make sure I have some time with each one of them. Maybe I also need to get on some groups that are related to the place that I'm going. Maybe I need to put a little effort into making sure that when I get to where I'm going, I have a couple friends that I can check in with there. Lower left stuff is important. Lower right is thinking about, how does this move fit into my life plan and where I'm going in my life and what this means for me? How is this going to actually help me? So this is a good checklist to kind of go through in your mind to get a holistic perspective on anything that you're working on. What you find as you start to take these factors into account in almost any context is that almost every single thing tends to focus on particular quadrants and ignore other quadrants. Even just knowing that, you can go in with this checklist and automatically make it better by just being like, hey, you guys, there's other aspects that we need to include here.
So that's the basic idea behind the quadrants. As you've seen, they're an incredibly useful tool for making sure we're considering all of the major aspects of reality as they relate to whatever we're trying to understand. No matter what the topic or project may be, the quadrants help us to avoid reductionism by reminding us to check in with every dimension of what's actually going on. In this next section, we're going to look at three important concepts that non-reductionist philosophy brings to the table: quadratic zoom, scale, and primacy. These significantly expand the usefulness of the quadrants by taking them beyond being just a checklist or a categorization exercise and adding important layers of nuance, helping us to avoid common mistakes by considering the appropriate level of scale of our analysis, as well as the relative importance and relationship between the different aspects of reality depending on the project. Just like in the previous sections, I'm going to use a variety of examples to illustrate these ideas. Don't worry about learning every graph or following every detail of each example. The goal isn't to fully grasp those specific applications yet. What I really want you to understand are the concepts themselves. Once you understand what zoom, scale, and primacy are, you'll understand why they're important, and later videos will give us the opportunity to explore the application in much greater detail. So with that in mind, let's keep going.
Okay, so far we've been talking about quadrants, but now we're going to talk about quadratic zoom, or quadrants within quadrants. And generally, when we're doing quadratic zoom and we're talking about levels of scale, the quadrant that we start with is considered to be the intermediate quadrant. And zooming out, you have macro, zooming in, you have micro and nano. And so we can talk about different scale distinctions. But zooming out from the quadrants, we get to the NRP macro map. And so as we zoom out, these quadrants are maps of reality in the upper right. And there are other important aspects to non-reductionist philosophy besides just our maps. There's also the personal aspects of a non-reductionist philosophy, like how do I live these things out in the world? There's the cultural aspects, how we come together and organize around these ideas and form a community. And in the lower right, we have our systems, our ways of organizing and making plans for the bigger picture. So for non-reductionism to really be complete, it has to include all of these different factors, not just the upper right quadrant and the maps of reality. For non-reductionism to be a complete project, we have to really be honoring and being skillful in all these different dimensions. And really, non-reductionism is the only meta theory that's actually holistic and complete in this way. I'll say more about that later. If we zoom back in a little bit and look at the more intermediate level within each one of these quadrants, you can see that there are actually quadrants within each one of these quadrants. And we take into account all of those factors too. It's important to have the holistic understanding of each of these projects as well. And so when we zoom in even deeper to the micro level, there are a bunch of micro level maps. And some of these micro level maps even have nano elements. So we're talking about quadrants within quadrants within quadrants within quadrants, like in the case of 4P4Z, for example. Now, you might be looking at this and saying to yourself, whoa, that's a lot of detail. But I am going to be teaching a lot of these different micro maps, some of them individually having their own videos, because they're highly relevant to how non-reductionism gets applied in a bunch of different domains. So you'll definitely be seeing some of these micro maps coming up in other videos. And actually, some of these different micro maps, like the one on principles and the one on the roles in the community, I've actually already talked about in the last two videos. I didn't really talk about them in this particular quadratic form, but I basically made videos on them already. So what we're really looking at here is all the important aspects of what it really means to be able to do this project in a holistic way. Again, NRP is the only version of meta theory that's really having all these maps and doing all these projects. There might be other communities that you could say have scattered bits of what you're seeing here, but none of them are really doing any of these things in a holistic way, especially as it relates to the lower quadrants. None of them have an organized community or have any kind of big picture plans for how they're going to organize and do things in the world. But like I said, at some point, I'll go through and I'll teach several of these maps. The 4P4Z map is definitely important. The 4 S's of a sacred life practice, super important. A holistic approach to morals. Eventually, I'll be digging in and teaching about the application of non-reductionism in a bunch of different domains. And we're going to be looking at a lot of these maps more in detail in that context. But for right now, what I'm really just trying to teach you is about quadratic zoom and what it really is to take a holistic perspective and what it means to zoom out and zoom in. And I'm also using this as an opportunity to show you just how holistic and organized non-reductionism is. We're really taking a holistic perspective in all of these domains from macro to micro scale and doing it well. Non-reductionist philosophy is the only meta theory that talks about quadratic zoom and makes scale distinctions. And the scale distinction is going to come up again when we talk about 4P4Z and its application. But again, that's some more advanced material than what we're really going to get into now. Part of the reason why I think other meta theories don't have anything like this map is because you can really get a type of quadratic scale vertigo even trying to conceptualize something like this. It took me a very long time figuring out where everything goes and how it all relates to each other. They start to mirror each other and it can get really confusing. One of the reasons it's so helpful to even have a map like this is because it's definitely possible to do a type of quadratic reductionism or zoom level conflation, where, for example, I might think that having an organization system is the same thing as having a holistic life practice. So it's definitely a common thing that people will take an element or the quadrants from a lower level scale and think that it covers something on a higher level scale. So this is a type of quadratic reductionism or zoom level conflation. So having a very clear and explicit fleshed out version of this map from macro to micro can really help us to avoid this problem of quadratic reductionism. It can help us be more aware of when that's happening, and it really gives us what we need to be able to have the most healthy and holistic philosophy possible. Also, I think this would be a really cool poster size map from macro to micro where people could really get in and take time to study the details. So if you would want to check that out, let me know in the comments and keep an eye out on the link tree or in the description for that to come out in the future. So the other related idea that is a upgrade to meta theory unique to non-reductionism is the idea of primacy, which is basically just the understanding that as it relates to certain topics or in certain contexts, the quadrants relate to each other differently. And some of this goes back to disagreements about emergentism versus idealism and panpsychism. Panpsychists and idealists think that these quadrants co-emerge and they go all the way down and back. But if you're an emergentist, if you're actually familiar with science and what science knows as opposed to a religious thinker, you understand that the interior quadrants emerged at a particular point in history. Interiority doesn't go all the way down and back to the Big Bang. I'm not even going to get into some of the ridiculous things that have been said, anthropomorphizing things like chemistry as if it's a form of irritability. Anyways, if you understand that the interior quadrants are emergent, then you already understand that there's a nesting going on as it relates to ontology or the nature of reality. You already understand that the interior quadrants emerge in the context of exterior reality. So when it comes to ontology, ontology means what is it? Epistemology is how do you know? So in terms of what is it, in terms of what is reality, which is what quadrants is referencing, the aspects of reality, we understand that exterior reality is primary and the interiors emerge inside of exterior reality. So this is what I call nested quadratic holons. So let me say what nested quadratic holons are real quick. Maybe you already get the idea of nesting, like the nesting dolls. In other words, like one thing is inside of another thing. And quadratic, we already know that we're talking about the quadrants. So nested quadratic, so the quadrants nested in each other. And then holons. A holon is something that is simultaneously a whole that's part of a larger whole and has subparts. So for example, we as people are holons. We are part of a culture, we're part of an ecosystem, but we also have subparts. Like there's an ecosystem of life happening in my mouth, in my gut, in my body. I should probably also make it clear that a holon doesn't refer to a living thing in particular. For example, a sentence can be a holon. A sentence might be a part of a paragraph, might be part of a chapter, might be part of a book. A sentence has words within it, and there are letters within words. So a word is a holon. A sentence is a holon. A paragraph is a holon. So just to be clear, a holon is anything that is part of a larger whole and also has sub-level parts. And holons are shown as these nested circles within circles to illustrate that idea. So nested quadratic holons are basically exactly that, but with the quadrants. So how are the quadrants nested inside of each other that shows the relationship of how they relate to each other in the context of a particular project? The relationships of the quadrants are going to be different when we're talking about different projects. Different quadrants are primary depending on the topic, and that's what we're trying to show. So if we're talking about ontology or the nature of reality, we understand that consciousness emerges out of or is nested within reality. However, if we're talking about epistemology, how we know what is true about reality, we're perceiving reality from within our consciousness, and we have to solve these problems like the problem of other minds. Do we exist together in a shared reality? To then how can we know things about reality? So the primacy is different in the context of this different topic. If we're talking about ontology or the nature of reality, reality, we know that exterior reality is primary and consciousness is nested within it. If we're talking about epistemology and how we know reality, we know our subjective experience is primary and the world outside is something inside of our subjective experience. So these particular nested quadratic holons, as it relates to ontology and epistemology, are referencing ideas that come up a lot in philosophical conversations. But there are also other philosophical conversations, like around morality, where oftentimes different moral systems are pitted against each other in a reductionist way, like deontology versus utilitarianism. And often these ideas are presented in a winner-take-all reductionist kind of way. But in non-reductionism, we can understand how these different moral concerns can relate to each other. I'll get into that deeper in future videos, but for right now, I'm just showing you another example of how the quadrants relate to each other differently, depending on what the topic is. Another version of a nested quadratic holon in a slightly different form is the pyramid of philosophical primacy. As you can see, again, it's the true, the good, and the beautiful, the big three. And we already talked about how the quadrants come out of the big three. So the foundational primary emphasis is understanding exterior reality, the truth about reality, and then we're good in relation to what's true, and then we try to beautify it. The idea here is that you have to do these philosophical projects in the correct order to make the different projects harmonize with each other. And if we don't do that, then basically people end up doing one philosophical project at the expense of the other projects. They might favor a cosmological belief and end up negating epistemology, which is what we see a lot of religious people doing. Or some people try to act like what's good is what's true, or what's beautiful is what's good and what's true. This is also a version of quadratic reductionism. Also later we'll be getting into 4P, 4Z and non-reductionist epistemology. And what 4P, 4Z means is 4 prime epistemic methods, that's the 4P, in all 4 ontological zones. That's the quadrants. So when we talk about primary epistemic methods, we're talking about fundamental ways of knowing. In terms of what ontological zone or what quadratic aspect of reality we're talking about, there is a particular prime epistemic method that is the best at getting at knowledge in relation to that quadrant. So for example, the best way to know about the upper right things in reality is with the scientific method. The best way to know about upper left personal experience is through phenomenology, through getting personal reports from the people who are feeling those feelings. The best way to understand culture or sociology is through hermeneutics, through understanding shared meanings. And the best way of knowing about systems is with systems theory. So these are the primary approaches to knowledge in these quadrants. You can use the other epistemic methods as it relates to all the quadrants, and sometimes a combination of the methods. But the prime epistemic methods for each quadrant are the best ways and the most fundamental types of data as it relates to those quadrants. There's much deeper things to get into as it relates to understanding our epistemology. We have a flow chart to go through in terms of our method of analyzing different claims. We figure out contingent ontological factors, scale distinctions. There's things like tetravalidation, which is checking in the other quadrants to see if there are the expected correlations in there, checking your personal bias and all that. But we won't get into any of that in this video. For right now, what I'm really just trying to show you is that the quadrants relate to each other differently in different projects, and that primacy is a thing. It's not just give equal emphasis to all quadrants in all situations. In some situations, or as it relates to some particular projects, some quadrants do deserve more emphasis. They are more primary. The quadrants relate to each other differently depending on what it is that we're trying to do. And so depending on what the project is or what the factors at play are, we'll probably have to understand the data or the factors from different quadrants differently and weigh them differently. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, that's a bit more advanced, and we'll get more into that in the future. But I know there are some people who are thinking, okay, so you're taking into account these factors. This isn't just a categorization game, is it? How do you know which quadrant has the most important data in terms of different projects? And that's an important and valid question. For some projects, some quadrants are more important, are more primary, and we should be able to make those distinctions. Non-reductionism is the only meta theory that does recognize that and does have answers to those questions about how the quadrants relate to each other and what quadrants are primary in what context.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've now learned one of the foundational elements of non-reductionist meta theory. These aren't just abstract philosophical ideas. They're practical tools for making better sense of ourselves, other people, and the world around us. And they have applications across virtually every human discipline. As this series continues, we're going to keep on building these foundations one element at a time. If these ideas resonate with you and you'd like to play a more active role in helping build this movement, I'd like to invite you to apply for the Steward Leadership Training. The Steward level is the first formal level of leadership within non-reductionism. It's designed for people who want to understand the fundamentals of the philosophy, help guide new members, preserve the integrity of the material, and contribute to building healthy communities both online and in the real world. You can learn more and apply using the link in the description. One thing I do want to say is that all of the core ideas of non-reductionism will be publicly available. We're not gatekeeping our ideas. They will all eventually be available online and here on our YouTube channel. If you prefer to study independently, you can do that. And there will be opportunities to demonstrate your understanding and test into different leadership levels over time. That said, I really encourage people to go through the training if they can. It's not just about learning the material, it's about having mentors to guide you, getting feedback on your thinking, asking questions in real time, and building relationships with other people who are serious about developing these ideas together. That community aspect is an important part of the process. With that said, I want to give a big thanks to all the Patreon supporters. Shout out to the new Patreons, Mike Rizell and Gabriel Schussler. If you want to support the development of this work and get involved, please consider becoming a Patreon. If this video was valuable to you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell to be notified when new videos come out, and share this video with people who you think would be interested. It's a free and easy way to help the channel, and it's much appreciated. And from here, you can move on to part 4 of the Non-Reductionist Fundamental series. In that video, we're going to be digging deeper into the theory and learn about the next element, lines. I'll see you there. Peace.